Welcome to Season 1 of Press the Button. As part of this 10-episode season called Taking Back the Narrative, we are handing the microphone to members of communities affected by nuclear weapons, so they can share their stories and their experiences in the ways they want them to be told. Today's guest is Jasmine Owens. She is the Associate Director of the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Program at Physicians for Social Responsibility. She discusses how we begin to make this work equitable, and how we make sure that those most affected by nuclear weapons are at the center when creating nuclear policy.
Throughout this season of Taking Back the Narrative, we've discussed how impacted communities are often left out of the conversation about nuclear weapons, and how their experiences are ignored or minimised. This really reinforces our need to centre Indigenous people and people of colour in our work. When it comes to policy decisions, the most affected people simply cannot be ignored. It's crucial that they have a platform to speak, to be heard, and have a voice in policy making. And it's important to remember this is not just an American problem. Those outside the US have been disproportionately affected by nuclear weapons, and they don't always have access to those that can influence policy decisions. In fact, I myself became aware of this issue growing up in Australia, and I remember when the French conducted nuclear testing in Mururoa Atoll, harming the people of French Polynesia. As a teenager, I was simply outraged. And the Australian Aboriginal people are no strangers to the impacts of British nuclear testing in the Australian outback in the 1950s. So given all of this, how do we begin to make this work more equitable? When creating nuclear policy, how do we make sure that those most affected by nuclear weapons are at the centre? Today, I'll be speaking with Jasmine Owens. She's the Associate Director of the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Program at Physicians for Social Responsibility. It's a pleasure to have you with me here today, Jasmine.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to come chat with you.
So let's dive right in. When you think about who's involved in policy decisions and who is centred in this work, who comes to mind?
So, and I just want to preface, this is going to be a very honest and blunt conversation, but I think it has to be that way because I think it's the only way we're really going to achieve progress within the anti-nuclear community. So to answer your question, unfortunately, it's often older white men who have been doing this work for decades, some of which who are very much stuck in Cold War thinking that simply is not applicable to today's complex geopolitical environment. And this creates many problems, one being that as a result, there's very little innovation, creativity, and diversity of thought that's required to tackle the issue of nuclear abolition, because it's not just about nuclear weapons. It's connected to so many other issues. It's connected to the broader systems of injustice that we need to dismantle in order to dismantle these weapons. And they've been stuck in their ways for so long, applying the same techniques for years, despite seeing little to no progress on our issues. And on top of that, those in decision-making roles, those who are in these rooms where policy is being crafted, are largely removed from the actual impacts of these weapons. They don't have to live near contaminated sites, whether that's from uranium mining or milling, nuclear reactors, downwind from old test sites, etc. They haven't been directly impacted by nuclear weapons. And therefore, they often talk about these weapons in a rather abstract way that isn't really grounded in the reality of the perpetual harm that is being caused by the mere existence of these weapons, let alone their use. And so we've seen, again, little progress on arms control or disarmament in recent decades. And the effort to provide justice through compensation, whether that's monetary or otherwise, has been lackluster at best and downright negligent at worst. And because of the homogeneity of the field, yes, it's starting to get a little more diverse, but we still have a long way to go that favors white men and women. The field itself is not very welcoming to people of color or impacted community members who are largely people of color, which then makes it difficult for these people to engage in this work and to want to continue to engage in this work.
Jasmine, I want to thank you for your honesty. These aren't easy conversations to have at all, but they're so critically important. And not just because these impact our values and because it's the right thing to do to be centering and talking about the people most impacted, but also because we know if we're going to solve these problems, if we're going to have any chance, we need a diversity of perspective, background, lived experiences to bring to bear on solving this problem. So I just want to thank you for doing that. And I think throughout this season too, we've seen that as we look at allowing people to take back the narrative, these are difficult conversations and that they're ones that we need to have. And we thank you and others who've been on this season for joining us. How do we ensure that those most impacted people are at the centre of our efforts? If we have an unwelcoming field, what do we need to be doing to change that?
There's a lot of work. So I think we definitely need to begin by changing the culture of the community so that we're not just valuing a very narrow traditional idea of expertise as a way to engage on the topics of nuclear abolition or nuclear policies in general. You don't need to have a PhD or master's from some expensive ivory tower school in nuclear physics or political science to have a productive, informational, and valuable discussion on nuclear weapons. Lived experiences of impacted communities are just as valid as any degree out there. Because who am I to think that just because I got a master's in nuclear weapons that I know better than a downwinder, the health effects that they have to endure as a result of living downwind from these US nuclear sites, or those who have to live near a US nuclear laboratory like the Savannah River site that's just poisoning nearby communities that are largely Black communities in Georgia. This lived experience of the harm of nuclear weapons is crucial in our work to abolish them because our policies have to be grounded in this reality. Policymakers have to have their policies informed by the lived experiences of those who know firsthand the dangers of these weapons, because I think anything else, as we've seen, is incredibly short-sighted. Policies that are, seek to maintain the modernization program of the US nuclear arsenal should absolutely be informed by the experiences of those who have to live near uranium mines that are still contaminating their communities and killing their loved ones, or hear the stories of missileers developing cancers from sitting in these missile silos for hours on end, days at a time. So I think it's absolutely necessary that impacted community members need to be included in the decision-making process around policies if we're going to enact meaningful, effective nuclear policy. And on top of that, I think what kind of helps facilitate that is centering our messaging, our organizing around the human and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons. I think that's crucial in creating space for impacted communities to have their voices heard and validated and to be involved in policymaking. So that messaging is really important. And kind of as an aside, like this message coupled with an intersectional framework, which I know was discussed in the first episode of the season 1, is really successful in bringing in new activists into the movement because we're meeting people where they're at. We're introducing and educating them on nuclear weapons in language and framing that is applicable to their own lives, that helps make it seem like more of a proximate issue rather than some abstract concern. And as nihilistic as some people want to be, I do think in general, people really do care about each other. And we do want ultimately to see the best for everyone and to achieve peace. And when we do focus on these issues, it really does engage people more than just like talking about like deterrence or all of these other topics that wind up dominating the conversations.
So this season, we've discussed how nuclear frontline communities are often indigenous or comprised mainly of people of colour. And Jasmine, what are the best ways to engage these communities in a way that uplifts them equitably?
A lot of the work that we need to do in order to engage communities in a way that uplifts them, that acknowledges and respects the harm that they've endured and is equitable and inclusive, I think needs to be done internally as a community. Something I've heard from others is that the anti-nuclear community is further along than other sectors within the peace and security field because we have been more engaged in the honest conversations of where we're at. But my issue is that's kind of where it ends. there is a lot of talk, but not a whole lot of action after the fact. And that's something that these communities have to deal with a lot, of NGOs coming in and claiming that they care about their issues and want to help, but don't really do anything, or just use these communities as tokens to prove that they're doing the right thing. And these communities, they can spot this from a mile away. They know when it's just lip service. So if we're going to engage impacted communities in our work, we have to make sure that we're doing so in a manner that is reciprocal, not transactional. And I won't speak too much on this topic since I know that there is going to be an episode focused on this specific issue. But I think this process definitely includes humility. It includes listening and taking a back seat sometimes. And most of all, accountability for how we may be or may not be perpetuating the very systems oppressing these communities. That's some self-reflection that we should be doing periodically to ensure that we are not causing harm in our interactions. And since a large portion of impacted communities are Black, are Brown, are Indigenous, it also requires genuine commitments from us to do the anti-racist work required to make the anti-nuclear community a safe space for them to engage in. These DEIJ initiatives within NGOs are not enough and are often used as an excuse to not do the real work required to be a genuine anti-racist ally. Already, studies are showing that investment in DEIJ is waning since everyone decided in summer 2020, after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that they were champions for racial justice. But this work isn't just a fad to be discarded once it's no longer deemed fashionable or profitable. Like, this has real dire impacts for people of color, especially dark-skinned people of color, because colorism is real and it is rampant. And people don't want to do the work because it's hard. And it does require a lot of self-reflection and accountability, but it has to be done if we're going to create a safe space for impacted communities to get more involved in our work. And I did want to touch briefly on, again, the importance of leading with an intersectional framework, because, yeah, these weapons, they are definitely linked to other issues that exacerbate the harm that impacted communities face daily. And I think it's so important that we understand this to ensure that our work and the policies that we're promoting are actually effective and meaningful. And as well, like, apart from engaging with impacted community members, like, if we want to bring more people of color into this field, if we want to bring more impacted community members into this field, we also have to recognize the other harms they face that aren't necessarily about nuclear weapons. And even, like, it's really difficult for me sometimes to continue to do this work on the seemingly countless days that I wake up to hear that another Black person was shot just for simply existing while Black. It's really difficult to wake up on the days when there's yet another legislation passed that's stripping women of their rights. And it doesn't really feel like this community holds space for intersectional identities that some of us live with. It feels very much like, oh, well, the show must go on, which to a degree, yes, we do have to do the work. But also it does feel sometimes dehumanizing at times, because I don't feel like I can bring my full self to my work because so much of my identity isn't being acknowledged or validated, or just there's not any holding of space for that. And this definitely isn't a problem unique to the anti-nuclear community by any means. It's definitely a product of the white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist system that we live under. But it's definitely perpetuated so long as these same people are in power who refuse to share power or to create a safer space for Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer folks who are working on these issues. And so there's a lot of internal work that we have to do. We need to be having these conversations as a community if we are going to create a space that is safe and inclusive and welcoming and uplifting of impacted community members who do have very intersectional identities.
You've spoken about messaging as a way to bring people in, and the importance of talking about intersectionality and the ways that this nuclear issue impacts other issue areas and people in particular. Is the current environment welcoming and safe for these groups? Is there more we need to be doing in addition to messaging? So once we have people interested, what do we do to make sure they feel heard and not tokenized?
So no, this space is not very welcoming to impacted communities, to communities of color, to young people. I think that there has been an issue with sharing power that has resulted in like the tokenization of like impacted communities, of young people of color trying to work in this field. Apart from thinking about like race and whatnot, it really is about power. I think part of the problem is that because it's the same people doing this work that have been doing it for decades, that it's kind of become a part of their identity, which inherently isn't wrong. But what that creates is this environment that doesn't really allow genuine engagement or involvement of impacted community members, of people of color, of young people. And then, as I mentioned, what happens is that impacted communities or people of color or, insert community are then treated as tokens of progress, whether that's in meetings or events or what have you, which it's just meant to be like, hey, look at the work that we're doing. We have young people here. We have a Marshallese here. We have a downwinder here. Like, look how great it is. But if we're not giving them the mic, if we're not giving them the opportunity to share their stories and talk about these issues how they want to talk about, then it's just tokenization at that point. And that doesn't feel good. So I think it really is about sharing the mic. It's about taking a step back and understanding that like you or I are not always the right messenger. And that sometimes someone else is going to be a lot better at delivering or talking about a policy, delivering a message, what have you, than I could ever do. And that's not a fault on me, that it's not a reflection of me, because this isn't about us as individuals. It's about this work and the need to abolish nuclear weapons so that we're not causing further harm on these communities. And I think the field has a lot of anti-racist work to do, quite frankly, as well, beyond just in implementing diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice efforts, which even that is already fading after just 3 years, when the wave of summer 2020, after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, everyone was talking about DEI and implementing policies and putting out statements and all that jazz. And 3 years later, there has been a noted decline in this work. And this isn't a fad. This isn't something to do when it seems popular or like it's going to make you the most money. Like, this is real people's lives that we're dealing with, whether it's impacted community members, whether it's the people that you're working alongside of in your organizations. Like, we have to live through this every day. And it's important that we treat anti-racism, that we treat DEI as a genuine commitment and necessary for the work we're trying to do. I really think that we have to reevaluate how we view DEI in this community. And I know that there are some organizations who are doing the work, who are really trying, but I have noticed within the anti-nuclear community and elsewhere that it definitely has been fading a lot, and people aren't really concerned with it anymore. And that's really sad and disappointing, especially as a person of color myself, to be viewed as just, important when the time feels right. And then as soon as people aren't paying attention, it's like, well, we don't have to do this anymore. And that's not effective. And that's also going to impact the community if we're going to continue to grow, because we are small. There isn't a whole lot of focus on nuclear weapons right now, though that is rising with the war in Ukraine. But if we're going to bring in more people, if we're going to actually bring in diverse perspectives, people with differing identities, impacted communities, we have to make sure that the space we're bringing them into is actually inclusive and safe for them and values them as a whole person and not just what they can offer for the movement. And I think that's where we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing your perspective on that and the gains that might have been made, but the long way to go, and that we can't let this fade from our consciousness. And you certainly raise big issues to do with identity, power, tokenism, anti-racism. Thank you for the reminder that we need to really keep this and hold it centrally as we think about the work that we're doing on nuclear policy. I'd like to ask you about a personal experience now, if I might. You recently presented at a conference for the African affiliates of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War in Kenya. What was that like for you, presenting at your first international conference like that and addressing an audience where you had members there who were, a lot of them, quite affected by nuclear weapons and whose experiences have been overlooked. How did that affect you, and what lessons did you take away?
Oh, it had such an effect on me in such a positive way. It was so inspirational and impactful to hear firsthand from Africans about the challenges that they face in their countries. Because I think, one, on a personal note, the story that really catalyzed me into this work and is the reason like why I am a nuclear weapons abolitionist and why I'm sitting with you today was learning about the Shinkolobwe mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and how in World War II, 80% of the uranium from the bomb dropped on Hiroshima came from this mine. It was crucial during the Cold War for the United States to have access to this mine. And as soon as the DRC gained independence and their democratically elected Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, thought about potentially restricting some access to these mines to the US, Belgium, the UK, and was potentially pursuing an alliance with the Soviet Union, we helped assassinate him and then propped up a dictator for decades who was more concerned with enriching himself and his cronies than actually bettering the Congolese society. And so learning more about uranium mining elsewhere in Africa, because I was so focused on the DRC, it was so informational. I learned so much about the lingering effects of these mines on these communities, because now in some places too, these mines are being used for mining other materials, but the uranium is still there and they don't have the proper protective gear to protect themselves from radiation exposure. And so it's still an issue. And especially as there are calls, I know, within the US for restarting uranium mining, both within the US and elsewhere, like it's so important to be reminded of this information so that we aren't perpetuating the same systemic harm that has been going on for decades. And from all of this, at PSR, at Physicians for Social Responsibility, where I work, we're actually in the process of planning a webinar to bring these experts into the US anti-nuclear community so that more of us can learn from these experts that I had the honor of learning from while in Kenya. And as I said before, it's so important to have these discussions and to hear directly from impacted community members and the harms they face to ground us in our works in order to bring that humanist perspective and to avoid falling into the trap of only talking about nuclear weapons in an abstract way that is very much void of the real world implications. But it honestly felt really weird sitting up there and talking to people who are being directly impacted by nuclear weapons. I mean, I was so honored to be asked to speak on a youth forum, and I talked about the intersectional nature of nuclear weapons and the need for broader systemic change if we are ever going to actually achieve nuclear abolition. But it definitely felt like, why am I up here right now when they can speak better to these issues than I can? And I think it's definitely a balance, because on the one hand, it's so incredibly important for impacted community members to be able to speak for themselves, to share their stories in their own way, because that is the most authentic and accurate way to bring awareness to the human and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, I do understand that it can be extremely overwhelming and exhausting for impacted community members to have to constantly relive their trauma in front of these audiences so that they can hopefully maybe receive the justice they deserve. Mary Dixon, who mentioned this in her podcast episode of how awful it can be to have to share your trauma over and over again, especially in front of people who only care about how much this justice is going to cost. That's so demoralizing. I understand it can take such a mental and emotional toll. And in those scenarios, I am more than willing to help amplify the voices and experiences of impacted community members so that they don't have to re-traumatize themselves over and over again. And also because they're whole human beings with lives and other work that they're doing that is completely separate from nuclear weapons, and asking them to also engage on our work isn't always respectful of their time or their capacity to do so. So I think this really underscores the importance of how we really need to be in communication with impacted communities about their capacity to engage in our work. If they have the energy and want to do so, then it's our duty to uplift them. But if they simply don't have the time or mental energy to expend on this work, then it's our duty to work with them to ensure that we are sharing the right messages that they want people to hear. So much of this intersectional, human-centered work is about give and take. It's about listening, then acting, rather than dominating the conversation off the bat. And it's so much about decentering ourselves and working in cooperation and collaboration with others, which I think can be lost in the fray, as especially with organizations having to work and compete against funding, or people who kind of their whole life is this work, and it can be very difficult for them to wrap their heads around, it's of taking a step back. And so, but it's something we have to do, and we do have to have these conversations, and we do have to do a lot of, I think, self-reflection and self-accountability as we continue this work. Because even myself, I had an experience in a meeting recently with impacted community members where one of them had said, like, we've been doing this for decades. It really brought me back to reality and made me realize, like, wait, yes, just because I have only recently learned about these issues and have recently begun working on them doesn't mean that the work just started, that these communities have been doing this for decades, most likely, but they just haven't been given the space or the attention or the recognition that they deserve to have their stories heard and to be meaningful participants in decision-making and policymaking.
Thank you for sharing with us those tensions that are there, right? So you made the case for why it's so important to have those voices present, to center them in our work, but then the challenges of just how you do that and the maybe weirdness that you felt in talking to people who'd had these experiences, maybe at times trying to represent those voices and perspectives, not having gone through them yourself, but not wanting to re-traumatize those on whose behalf you might need to speak. So that's such a fine, delicate balance, and something that I think we do need to pay a lot of attention to, and to really think about how we can center these voices and issues in the work in ways that is respectful of everybody. You've also made a terrific case for why you don't need a master's or a PhD to engage in this issue. And quite frankly, we need lots of people who don't have a master's or PhD in this issue to contribute. And so how can listeners who have really been interested in this, how can they learn more and educate themselves on this issue?
Okay, so there's a lot of resources I could share, but I will stick to 4 in the interest of time. So I wanted to start off with Shankwa Biswas, who y'all had on the podcast for the first episode. She has a book called Nuclear Desire, which I think is a great overview of nuclear weapons, the nuclear order, the nonproliferation regime through a post-colonial lens. And there's a great quote at the beginning of the book that I think really gets to the heart of what I've been saying. And it says, "To build peace now more than ever, it is necessary to build more than peace. To refuse nuclear weapons, we must refuse much more than nuclear weapons." And I think this really hits at the heart of the intersectionality of nuclear weapons, how they don't exist in a silo, how they absolutely work with other issues we're facing, like climate change, racism, food insecurity, et cetera, to exacerbate the harm being caused. And that we really do have to tackle these issues together if we're really going to make progress on abolition. And then I wanted to share the Nuclear Truth Project, which is an international initiative connecting Indigenous and First Nations peoples, affected community members, international and civil society organizations, experts in governments working for nuclear abolition. So they are doing the real work to center the lived experiences of impacted communities. They have a page on protocols to follow when trying to engage these communities that I think is crucial for anyone who is doing this work to pay attention to and to implement as they are reaching out to impacted communities and trying to collaborate with them. And their website is nucleartruthproject.org. And they also have a great Instagram, which is at nuclear_truth_project. As well, in a similar vein, Nuclear Voices is a project led by Lily Adams at Union of Concerned Scientists, which seeks to share information and experiences from impacted communities. So there's a testimonies page where you can read stories from Indigenous communities, uranium workers, Hibakusha, which are atomic bomb survivors from Japan, and more. And that website is nuclearvoices.org. And lastly, there's a recent article from International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which is my organization PSR's international affiliate, and the co-president of IPPNW, Sally Ndungu, who was also president of the Congress in Kenya that I recently attended. And she wrote about the impacts of nuclear weapons on Africa. And I think that this piece is a great window into how the intersectional nature of nuclear weapons manifests in Africa via food insecurity. And so for folks listening who are interested, you can just Google IPPNW nuclear weapons, a big threat to Africa too. And it should be the first one that pops up. But I think, this is just a small example of the great research and knowledge and resources out there on the human and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons. But I think these are a great starting point for anyone who does want to learn more.
Terrific. Thank you, Jasmine, for sharing those resources and also for speaking to us with such honesty and clarity. I think it's probably a difficult conversation for some people to hear, but it's so critically important. And your plea to people to listen and then act and to give and take is really well made and hopefully very well heard. So thank you for joining us in this season of Taking Back the Narrative. And we wish you all the best in your work and the effort that you're undertaking with PSR to bring those voices and the people that you met when you were at the Congress in Africa to the policy space in the United States. It's certainly very much needed. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Alex Hall, Angela Kellett, and Loan Billett, and in San Francisco by Charles Crosby. Audio engineering by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is Black Nymph by Peridot. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.